They stripped her of every weapon, laughed as they pushed her into hostile terrain, and dared her to survive without violence. But they forgot that nature had always been her sharpest blade, and that the earth itself would rise to fight beside her. What began as humiliation would end in silence, because no one left to mock her would be left standing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The contest wasn't supposed to be real, not to her at least. At first, it was just a twisted tradition among the elite. A survival trial orchestrated by the paramilitary academy deep in the Oran Expanse, a remote jungle outpost where satellite signals died and screams carried for miles. Each year, the cadets at Talon Reach held what they called the Gauntlet, a brutal rite of passage that separated the soldiers from the expendables. But this year's Gauntlet had a new contender, a quiet girl named Kailani Reese, the only civilian ever permitted entry, and only because she had embarrassed one of the commandants in front of foreign dignitaries. They gave her a choice: face court-martial for striking an officer, or complete the Gauntlet, weaponless. She chose the jungle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most would have wept. She didn't. When the steel doors slammed behind her and the overseers activated their thermal drones to monitor the bloodbath they expected, Kailani simply walked. Not fast. Not frantically. She moved like she belonged there. The other contestants, 6 of them, each armed, trained, and arrogant, watched her disappear into the underbrush and laughed. But by nightfall, they stopped laughing, because Kailani had vanished, without a trace, without sound, without fear. Instructors watched from hidden towers, sipping bitter coffee and placing bets on which cadet would bag her first. They hadn't seen anyone like her before. No kill record. No rank. No documented survival training. Just rumors. Whispers of a girl raised on volcanic islands where maps faded and storms swallowed drones. They underestimated her because she didn't speak much, because she didn't boast, because she was small. But the jungle didn't care about bravado, and neither did Kailani. Her advantage wasn't in firepower or tactics. It was in patience. Observation. She didn't run from her pursuers, she learned them. She watched how they moved, what they touched, which ones disturbed the bird flocks without noticing. She mapped the terrain in her head faster than any satellite could. She found a fissure where steam escaped from under the roots of a fallen banyan. There, she waited. Not for help. For them. On day 2, one of the cadets, Braken, heavy and cocky, wandered near her hiding place. His boots crushed a patch of rattan vines, unaware that they were home to fire ants. Kailani didn't need to attack. She only needed to watch. As he screamed, swatting and rolling in the mud, she slipped his canteen and thermal tracker from his belt and vanished again. 1 cadet down, 6 remaining. By the 3rd day, Talon Reach's commandant, Victor Alrek, leaned closer to his surveillance feeds. He hadn't expected entertainment, but this was something else entirely. She hadn't struck a single blow. And yet, the arena was shifting. Morale among the cadets fractured. They argued over who saw her last, over whose turn it was to hunt. But Kailani didn't hunt. She shaped the jungle to hunt for her. She wove leaves over pits and lured 2 more into a sinkhole by simulating animal sounds. One shattered his femur. The other was dragged out unconscious. Again, no trace of her. She was becoming a ghost, a myth among her enemies, and a problem for those who thought they were watching a spectacle. By day 4, no one laughed anymore. Commandant Alrek paced behind the tinted glass of the operations deck, his fists clenched behind his back as his officers called out telemetry reports. 5 cadets remained. 3 had been pulled from the field with injuries severe enough to warrant evacuation. None of them had spotted her. No footage of her face, no recordings of an ambush. It was as if the jungle itself had turned traitor and swallowed her whole. Kailani crouched beneath a thicket of spiraled bamboo, her body camouflaged with red clay and ash. She wasn't hiding out of fear, she was conserving energy. She listened to the vibrations in the ground, the calls of the birds, the shifts in insect rhythm, because in the wild, silence meant a predator was nearby. Her entire childhood had been a lesson in decoding nature's warnings, When the wind stilled and the crows stopped calling, she moved. A trio of cadets swept the valley beneath her perch that morning, talking louder than they should, trying to provoke her. "Come out, little ghost," one of them taunted, a tall girl named Saren whose rifle jutted from her back like a third limb. "No one's impressed. You'll be picked up in a body bag like the rest." The others chuckled, nervous more than amused. They'd begun to fear her without knowing why. They hadn't seen her, but something primal told them they were being watched. Kailani didn't respond. She never did. Instead, she twisted the thorns of a creeping vine into a jagged loop and draped it between two low-hanging branches near a narrow trail. She lured them with their own bravado, left a bootprint in soft mud, snapped a stick just enough to sound like movement. Saren fell for it first, charging toward the disturbance. The moment her leg hit the snare, she toppled. Thorns tore into her calf as she crashed into a tree. Screams echoed through the valley. Another down. 4 remained. Back at base, Alric slammed a fist against the screen. "She's not even fighting. This isn't combat. This is sabotage." An aide cleared his throat gently. "Sir, technically, she's within the rules. No weapons, no direct assault. She's using the environment. She's making us look like fools." Alric barked. "This is a military test, not a fairy tale." But in the forest, Kailani didn't care about rules or pride. She knew that survival wasn't about dominance. It was about understanding. She harvested resin from a sap tree, rubbed it along the length of a fallen branch, and placed it near a water source the cadets had marked days earlier. She knew they'd find it. She wanted them to. By the time night fell, the resin had hardened like glass. When one of the cadets, Tomaz, the tracker, tried to use the branch as a walking stick, it shattered in his hand and drove splinters into his palm. He dropped his rifle in pain. As he knelt to retrieve it, he spotted something else, a pile of stones stacked deliberately in a triangle. Kailani's mark. He panicked. She was close. He ran, right into a tree hollow swarming with hornets she'd stirred earlier with smoke. His screams pierced the dark. Another cadet eliminated. 3 left. Kailani didn't rest. Not yet. She climbed a ridge where the fog was thickest, planted reflective shards taken from Tomas's broken scope in a pattern around her location, then slipped away. When the next drone scanned the terrain, it registered multiple heat signatures in a spread formation, confusing her position entirely. To the officers above, it looked like she'd split into 5. She watched as the remaining cadets grew paranoid, each believing the others might secretly be Kailani in disguise. Unity dissolved. Infighting began. The jungle had become her language, her armor, her accomplice. In the quiet moments between ambushes, Kailani remembered why she had agreed to this madness in the first place. Not for redemption, not to prove herself, but because Alric had made the mistake of insulting her mother's legacy. Years ago, her mother, also nameless, also underestimated, had died during a humanitarian mission led by Alric's unit. He covered it up, called her a casualty of poor navigation. But Kailani knew the truth, and she would make sure Talon Reach never forgot it. This wasn't about winning a trial anymore. It was about dismantling a myth. That only those with guns, badges, and brutality deserved to survive. By dawn, one of the cadets, barely 19, shaking, sleepless, dropped his weapon and pressed his emergency beacon. "I forfeit," he muttered. "Get me out." Only 2 left, and Kailani had just started. At sunrise, a mist crawled over the jungle like breath exhaled from the earth itself. Birds had not yet begun their calls. The trees were eerily still. Somewhere beneath the canopy, a silent war continued, one where metal had no place and every shadow could be a weapon. 2 cadets remained. One was Landon Kerr, a ruthless sniper known for his arrogance and precision. The other was Neva Wren, tactical genius, fastest graduate in the Academy's recent history. Both were deadly. Both were trained, but neither were prepared for her. Kailani no longer hid. She had studied their patterns. She knew their supply drops, the sound their boots made when shifting terrain, even how they whispered during rest. One mumbled strategy, the other talked in dreams. She moved through the terrain like vapor, not to stalk them, but to break them from within. Fear was now her most powerful tool. Back in the control tower, Commandant Alric no longer watched with amusement. His jaw was locked, his eyes twitching between failing signal feeds. Drones were going blind. Cameras blurred out. The environment had begun to interfere with their sensors, but it wasn't natural. Kailani had disabled 2 signal repeaters the night before, using makeshift oil she had distilled from crushed seeds and fiber insulation taken from the first cadet's bag. Alrek grunted. "She's jamming us." His officers looked confused. "With what, sir?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Kailani crouched above a dried riverbed where Neva had chosen to set a trap. She'd rigged a snare, covered it with leaves, and smeared fish oil to attract scent-driven predators. But Kailani wasn't just observing. She was learning. As Neva stepped away to hide and wait, Kailani descended silently and reversed the trap, raising the snare's trigger point just enough that it would catch a human leg, not a creature's paw. Then she left a trail of disturbed dirt leading directly to it. 30 minutes later, Landon followed the tracks like a hound, too angry to think clearly. The moment his boot triggered the loop, the vine yanked him into the air upside down. His scream was muffled by the snapping of branches. Neva leapt out from hiding, rifle raised, but saw Kailani nowhere, only her own trap used against an ally. She hesitated, and that pause cost her. Kailani struck from behind, not with fists or blades, but with nature. She had crafted a sling from twisted roots and clay stones. With one perfect throw, she struck Neva in the ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. Before the cadet could recover, Kailani darted past, kicking her rifle into a ravine. She didn't kill. She didn't need to. She let the jungle finish what she started. Landon, still hanging, was now flailing. Neva tried to crawl toward him, but her legs buckled. Kailani didn't stay to gloat. She vanished again, slipping between trunks like smoke, her mission not yet done. Alric's control room descended into chaos. "We've lost both feeds," one tech reported. "Her signature's gone. Again." Another added, "Sir, Cadet Wren activated her extraction beacon. She's requesting immediate pullout. Medics on standby." Alric's lips curled in disgust. She beat them, all of them, with dirt, with leaves. That night the skies cracked open with monsoon rain. Kailani stood barefoot atop the central rock formation that marked the finish line. She didn't wave. She didn't collapse in exhaustion. She simply waited, drenched and calm, for the floodlights to find her. And when they did, silence swept over the control tower. One by one, the instructors lowered their heads. Alric walked out to meet her, alone, without his guards. "You should have died in there," he muttered, eyes narrow. "You were never meant to succeed." Kailani looked past him toward the horizon. "You gave me nothing," she said softly, "and still, I built a war you couldn't win." Quote, "You think this means anything?" Ulrich spat. "You'll never be part of the system. You'll always be just a footnote, just an outlier." Kailani turned toward him finally, face unreadable. "That's fine," she replied. "I never wanted to be part of your system. I'm here to end it." The next morning, news of the Gauntlet's results spread across the continent. Every cadet eliminated. One civilian, unarmed, undefeated. No academy would ever hold a challenge like that again. But Kailani's war wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The jungle may have gone quiet, but the aftermath of Kailani's victory roared louder than any explosion. Within 24 hours of her standing atop the finish line, Talon Reach's encrypted footage began to leak, first as blurry clips on obscure channels, then as crystal-clear time-stamped feeds showing cadets falling one by one without ever seeing their opponent. Commentators called it a fluke, a scandal, a PR nightmare. Others called it evolution. In the heart of the capital city of Varela, military officials scrambled to contain the narrative. The official report listed the Gauntlet results as inconclusive due to technical interference. But by then, it was too late. Kalani Reese had become something more dangerous than a trained killer. She had become a myth. Whispers of the unarmed ghost traveled faster than drones. Recruits in training camps across the continent began imitating her tactics, setting traps instead of using brute force, listening to wind patterns, even studying soil density to detect movement. It wasn't just embarrassing to Talon Reach, it was threatening. Meanwhile, Kailani was nowhere to be found. She'd refused their mettle. She didn't wait for the debrief. She vanished the moment her feet touched the tarmac at the extraction zone. Cameras caught her figure retreating into a fogged-out valley, Since then, no one had seen her, not even those who tried to chase her down. Back at Talon Reach, Commandant Alrek faced his own reckoning. A quiet tribunal was called. No one dared bring charges publicly. His reputation was ironclad, and his connections reached the ministry itself. But doubts had been planted. An unarmed civilian had outwitted every elite cadet under his command. Questions about the Gauntlet's legitimacy, the cadets' overconfidence, and Alrek's motivation for including Kailani all began surfacing. He kept his composure in public, but behind locked doors, he was unraveling. He ordered full Black Ops surveillance on Kailani's last known location. Heat scans, drones, undercover field agents. None of them returned with anything useful. It was as if the terrain itself was defending her. More than once, an entire scouting team would enter the valley and vanish from radar, only to radio back 12 hours later, confused, disoriented, with memory gaps and reports of hallucinations. One soldier claimed she'd heard singing in a dialect lost for centuries. Another insisted the vines moved like they were alive. Alrek dismissed them all, officially. Privately, he began to wonder if something older and more dangerous than Kailani lived out there, or if Kailani had become something else entirely. In a remote village far from any map, a boy with a swollen eye limped into a healer's tent. He'd been running from slavers. The healer asked how he got away. The boy said a woman in the trees had guided him, whispered which paths to take, even left fruit and herbs wrapped in leaves near his sleeping place. She had no blade, the boy said, but the forest moved when she pointed. The healer didn't laugh. She had heard similar stories from miners, wanderers, even rebel fighters. All swore they'd been saved by a woman in the green. All described her the same way, barefoot, covered in clay, and silent. Kailani had become more than a victor. She had become a phantom woven into the roots of resistance. But her story hadn't ended. She was still hunting. She followed a name whispered by one of the injured cadets before extraction, Colonel Idran Vor, a man rumored to have overseen training accidents that never reached the records, a man who once led operations on the volcanic islands where her mother died. Where Kailani was born. Vore was no commandant. He was a tactician who never entered the field himself, a puppet master who let others bleed while he cleaned his gloves. His name was buried in layers of false identities, but Kailani traced him the way she once tracked jaguars, by the things he tried to hide. Empty plots and graveyards with mismatched records, burned documents with ink patterns only visible under moonlight. A mark he left on all his files, a spiral, barely noticeable, always pressed into the lower left corner. One night, in a compound fortified with electric fences and heat-sensing turrets, Vor received a package, no sender. Inside, a single twisted vine coiled around a claystone embedded with an old army pin, the kind only distributed at Talon Reach. His face turned white. "Is she alive?" his aide asked. "No," he whispered. "She's something else now." Kailani had declared her next battlefield. And this time, the environment wouldn't just be her weapon. It would be the battlefield itself. The city of Andros sat like a concrete parasite on the jungle's edge, trying to tame what it could never fully erase. There, behind mirrored towers and state-run media channels, Colonel Idran Vore spun his web. Unlike Alrek, Vore had no time for theatrics. He believed in patterns, manipulation, and most of all, control. Kailani represented everything he feared: unpredictability, silence, a ghost that defied protocol. And so he began to lay a new kind of trap, one built not from bullets, but bait. He knew she'd come, not out of vengeance, not out of ego, but because she was still hunting the truth. About her mother, about Talon Reach, about why people like him were never held accountable. So Vor devised a false lead. Deep in the black zone of the Ministry's classified archives, he planted a fabricated file. Operation Emberoot, unsealed. The bait? A forged document listing her mother's name as a covert operative who'd gone rogue. Kailani, he knew, would not resist reading it. The leak was allowed to surface through channels she had already hacked in the past. It wasn't a matter of if she'd find it, it was when. She did. At a former rebel safe house, buried in a cave riddled with moss and moss-eaten hard drives, Kailani scanned the file. Her eyes flicked over every line. until she reached the passage stating her mother had betrayed her unit, that she'd deliberately sabotaged a mission which cost lives, and died in the process. Kailani froze, not because she believed it, but because Vor had dared to weaponize her past. She knew it was bait, but she would walk into it anyway, not to disprove the lie, but to burn down the liar's entire system. 3 days later, an explosion rocked a decommissioned outpost once used for storage along the southern border. What no one noticed was that only one room had been destroyed, the archive chamber. Every other structure remained untouched. Vor received the footage with grim satisfaction. "She's sending a message," his aide said. "No," Vor muttered. "She's circling." What Vor didn't realize was that Kailani wasn't acting alone anymore. In the ruins of the jungle villages, among the silent rebels and displaced survivors, Kailani had quietly become a symbol. When she returned, barefoot and bruised, they didn't question her presence. They listened. She shared what she'd seen, showed them how Talon Reach had trained children to become assassins, how Vora had orchestrated Black Ops trials disguised as humanitarian missions, how he buried his crimes behind medals and uniforms, and more importantly, she taught them how to fight without weapons, how to reclaim the land, not just through bullets, but through silence, strategy, and the forest itself. Vora's next move was surgical. He hired a recon unit of ex-trackers, veterans who'd once survived entire winters in the mountains without fire or food. They were equipped with camouflage suits, thermal-disrupting gear, and drones that mimicked insects. Their mission was clear: flush her out, capture her alive, deliver her to a black site where no cameras would follow. The jungle didn't cooperate. The moment the team entered the rainforest perimeter, their compasses spun out. The insect drones failed to return. Their communication lines cut one by one. A captain named Rosenth, a hardened man with no belief in spirits, started mumbling about hearing footsteps that didn't match anyone's gait. 2 hours later, one of his team members screamed after falling into a pit of sharpened roots. They tried to extract him, only to find that someone had already cleaned the wound and stitched his leg with braided grass fibers. No attacker in sight. Back in Andros, Vor watched the reports come in with increasing agitation. His plan to draw her out was failing. Instead, she was pulling them in. Kailani had studied the terrain around the decoy site, Vora used as bait. She didn't stop the extraction team from entering, she redirected them. She laid false trails, guided them deeper into overgrown sectors no one had mapped in years. She turned the jungle into a mirror maze of silence and paranoia. And when they finally found a heat signature resembling her, it was only a clay dummy wrapped in animal hide, heated from within by smoldering embers. It exploded. Not with fire, but with spores. The same spores used by the ancient Viraean tribes. Numbing, hallucinogenic, disorienting. 2 trackers were found days later speaking in fragments of forgotten dialects, their hands covered in glyphs they claimed they hadn't drawn. Colonel Vor didn't sleep that night. For the first time in his career, he realized something horrifying. She wasn't walking into his trap. She was teaching him what a trap really looked like. Rain hammered the canopy like war drums, but underneath, all was still. The trackers who survived the spore trap were pulled from the jungle incoherent and fevered, and none could explain how their gear was stripped, how the jungle had seemed to move behind them. Colonel Vor ordered their memories scrubbed, and the mission reclassified as field misdirection due to environmental instability. But he didn't believe his own report. Not anymore. Kailani had become more than a symbol. She was now a strategy, a living principle. Rebels across the fractured provinces of Viraea adopted her methods. They stopped using crude bombs and outdated rifles. They used pressure, timing, terrain, distraction. They let their enemies march in, loud and proud, then buried them under vines, under sand, under silence. And in every village liberated by these tactics, Kailani's name was whispered not with reverence, but with caution, because no one could confirm seeing her in the flesh. She had become more legend than leader. In the shadow of Viraea's central military bastion, where Vor conducted most of his classified operations, a new unease began to settle. The concrete fortress was surrounded on all sides by man-made buffer zones, cleared forest, scorched soil, layered surveillance. No one could breach it without being detected from miles away. Or so they thought. One night, the inner perimeter alarms triggered without a single figure appearing on any camera feed. No breach, no sensor trip, no vibration alerts. Just a single rhythmic knock on the northern watchtower's steel wall. Tap, tap, tap. The guard who went to investigate found nothing. Just a single vine hanging from the upper ledge, tied into a spiral. Vor reviewed the footage in silence. That symbol again. He was being warned. At the same time, his assets began disappearing, one by one. Logistics officers, surveillance engineers. The ones responsible for the technology that once tracked Kehlani's every move. Their homes found empty, desks wiped, vehicles burned. On each scene, the same mark, always in a different form. A spiral drawn in ash. A spiral burned into leaves. A spiral etched into glass. Kehlani wasn't just targeting him. She was disarming the entire machine. And still, no blood, no bodies, no direct confrontation, just erasure. Controlled, patient, devastating. Vor called for a meeting of the remaining brass, his tightest circle. They met in a subterranean hall, surrounded by soundproof concrete and armored doors. "We're no longer dealing with a dissident," he said. "We're facing an ideological contagion. She's teaching them to think like her." One general, older and known for his cynicism, smirked. "Then we eliminate the ideology." Another nodded. "Burn the villages. Starve the terrain. She can't fight without nature." Vor said nothing for a long time. Then, slowly, he looked up. "She is the terrain now." 2 days later, firebombs rained down on 3 forest villages suspected of harboring rebel cells. The skies turned black. Acres of jungle smoldered. Civilians fled deeper into the wilds. Vor watched the operation from a drone feed with no emotion. Now we'll see what she does when her environment dies. But Kehlani had already predicted this move. As the fires spread, rebel groups evacuated coordinated zones they had pre-cleared weeks in advance. The burn perimeter Vor believed was punishment became, instead, a corridor, a funnel, one that pushed his forces into a narrow gorge laced with preset landslides, water traps, and rockfalls triggered not by explosives, but by carefully unbalanced stone markers and wind-guided tension lines. Within hours, 2 military convoys were wiped out by terrain they thought they controlled. The survivors crawled back with stories that made no tactical sense. The cliffs collapsed behind us. Like someone was watching. Like it was timed. Others spoke of mist moving in strange patterns. Of hearing drums where there were none. Of vines that seemed to writhe before snapping across their path. Kehlani had weaponized grief. Every tree cut down. Every home torched, every plant burned. She had turned into strategy, into pressure points the earth itself could feel. She didn't mourn the destroyed jungle. She used its ruins. Ash could blind. Charred trees could become spikes. Silence could become a war cry. In the ruins of a village reduced to ash, Vor's scouts found one item untouched, a seedling in a handmade clay pot, sitting upright on a blackened altar. Beneath it, carved into the stone in near-perfect spiral strokes, were the words, "You burned the jungle. You fed the soil." In the dead of night, just past the 3rd checkpoint to the north, an elite unit known as Echo Division vanished. They were Vor's best. No insignia. No records. No names. Specialists in acoustic warfare, trained to detect movement by the subtlest sound patterns, by breath, by heartbeat. But they didn't hear Kehlani coming. They didn't hear anything at all, because silence had become her weapon. What little was recovered from their base camp the next day showed no signs of struggle. No blood. No broken gear. Just a single triangular pendant left hanging from a branch, humming with subsonic resonance. The engineers who examined it said the device was nothing they had seen before. And yet, it wasn't tech. It was carved. By hand. Tuned by water and wind. It emitted frequencies that canceled sound itself in a 30-meter radius. Vor stared at the data. Then at the spiraling waveform etched into the field recorder. "She's learned to mute the battlefield," he muttered. "No," whispered the tech beside him. She's learned how to remove herself from the battlefield entirely. The next attack confirmed it. A forward munitions base was infiltrated. Not blown up, not looted, but reprogrammed. Dozens of rifles had their firing pins extracted and replaced with carved wooden decoys, indistinguishable by weight. Explosives were disarmed and turned into seed carriers, canisters packed with soil and dormant wild flora. When soldiers attempted to detonate a perimeter field, orchids bloomed. On every sabotaged object, someone had etched a message in code. A local dialect spoken by almost no one outside the Highlands. Translated, it read, "You built your weapons from our bones. Now your weapons feed our roots." It wasn't just rebellion anymore. It was philosophy. Kailani wasn't trying to win the war by fighting harder. She was unwriting the war itself. In whispered communiques across the continent, military analysts began calling her campaign the Unbattle. A strategy where no victory could be counted in bodies. Only in disarmament, confusion, transformation. Villages that once feared retaliation for harboring fugitives began hiding Kanani's symbols in plain sight. Not with banners, but with silence. If soldiers entered a town and the animals were too quiet, the birds absent, the winds eerily still, they turned back. Because that's when Kailani struck. Not with fire or steel, but with absence. Noise-canceling zones would erupt, plunging entire squads into dizzying disorientation. Vibration traps in the soil made their footsteps ricochet into their own sensors. Echoes that didn't bounce back told them, "You are not welcome here." But still, Vor pursued. And still, Kailani didn't kill him. She let him see everything fall apart. His soldiers reported strange hallucinations, memories they hadn't lived, dreams they didn't own, waking in confusion, sobbing without cause. What they didn't know was that Kailani had found a way into their heads, through the frequencies they'd weaponized, through the very tools designed to control her. She wasn't resisting anymore. She was reprogramming. One of Vor's officers defected, and with him came the most damning document of all, Kailani's early case file from the reconditioning labs. It wasn't a medical chart. It was a blueprint. Vor realized too late. She hadn't been a patient. She'd been a prototype. Everything they thought they'd suppressed in her, the sensory mapping, the neurological reinforcements, the biolinguistic training, it had worked. And then it had escaped. He stared at her file in disbelief. No sedative had ever really silenced her. No electric conditioning had ever erased her reflexes. She hadn't survived the system. She had absorbed it. And now she was rewriting it, through jungle, through mines, through silence. She wasn't fighting back. She was remaking the rules. By the time Vor realized he was the last piece on the board still playing the old game, Kailani's message arrived. Not in paper, not in voice, but in sensation. One morning, in his steel office surrounded by monitors and weapons, Vor stood up from his desk and felt something shift beneath his boots. A vibration. So subtle only his trained mind registered it. He reached down and lifted the floor panel. Beneath it was soil. Soil where concrete should be. He dropped to his knees, dug with frantic fingers, and found a sprout. Alive. Fresh. Unfamiliar. He looked up, and every monitor in the room went black. Then, for just a moment, a spiral appeared on each screen. And a single pulse echoed through the room. It wasn't sound. It was feeling. And it said, "I am not your enemy. I am your ending." By dawn, Kailani had transformed the clearing into something far more dangerous than a battlefield. It became a trap layered with intention, strategy, and the cold logic of survival. The vines weren't just obstacles. They were spring-loaded snares. The mud wasn't just slick. She'd mixed it with crushed thorns that could infect open wounds within hours. She knew which branches creaked under weight, which mosses released clouds of irritation, and which trees wept sap that could blind. The environment was no longer her backdrop. It was her silent army. The first to fall was Raynor, brash, impatient, eager to earn a kill and secure the praise of the instructors. He charged in alone, sword drawn, expecting an easy execution. Instead, he stepped on what looked like a harmless pile of leaves and vanished into a spiked pit Kailani had dug with a flat rock and her bare hands. The scream was sharp, then silent. The other contestants froze, staring at the fresh, sudden death of someone they'd trained with for years. Kailani, watching from a camouflaged perch high above, didn't flinch. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was survival. As they regrouped, one of them, Soren, attempted a flank through a hollowed-out log. Kailani had rigged it with 2 hornet nests and coated the inner walls with crushed wild onions to enrage the swarm. The scream this time was worse. Soren staggered out, face swollen and barely recognizable, before collapsing unconscious under the roots. The observers behind the mirrored canopy, the instructors, commanders, and broadcast analysts, were silent. No one had ever seen a participant weaponize the ecosystem so efficiently. What was once dismissed as a humiliation had turned into a masterclass in ecological warfare. By midday, the remaining 3 contestants, Myra, Halden, and Everick, were on edge. They no longer chased her. Now they were hunted. They whispered fears about spirits, curses, or traps that anticipated their thoughts. Kailani, who had grown up learning the pulse of wild terrain, simply adapted faster than they did. She didn't attack directly. She denied them water by contaminating the streams with sedative herbs. She blocked the sun in key spots by bending trees and tying their crowns together. She disrupted their sense of time and direction. Every moment in the jungle became heavier. The silence between them grew longer. Paranoia thickened. When Myra attempted to sleep, Kailani dropped a bag of charred resin pods nearby. They cracked like distant gunfire as they hit the ground, triggering Myra to bolt upright and straight into a tripline, rigged to whip her legs out from under her. She woke up hours later tied at the ankles, hanging upside down. Kailani never showed herself. She let the forest whisper her legend. The final straw came when Halden, normally the strongest of the group, began hearing voices. She hadn't said a word, but the rustling of wind and pattern of birdsong repeated in such eerie harmony that it mimicked human cadence. It wasn't madness. Kailani had trained certain birds to mimic whistles over the years, sounds she used in her village to communicate while hunting. Now those same birds served as psychological warfare. Everick, now the last one who hadn't been incapacitated, stood in the center of the jungle clearing that Kailani had claimed. Sweat pouring down his back, hands trembling, he shouted, "Face me like a soldier!" But there was no honor left in him, only fear. And Kailani knew. She emerged slowly from the shadows, not holding a knife or a spear, but just a chunk of petrified bark, hardened sharp. It was enough. Everick ran. Straight into the trap Myra had triggered hours before. She didn't chase. She just walked past him, head high, calm. The jungle had answered her challenge, and it had obeyed. The broadcast room was colder than usual, not because of the temperature, but because no one dared to speak. Rows of military officials, elite strategists, and covert agency representatives watched in stunned silence as Kailani moved through the jungle with the composure of a ghost and the efficiency of a tactician. She hadn't just survived the test, she had rewritten its rules. General Aderos, the highest-ranking officer in the room, leaned forward, fingers tented beneath his chin. For over a decade, the trial had existed to filter out the weak and spotlight the best. But what Kailani had done wasn't just rare, it was paradigm-breaking. She hadn't taken down her opponents by force. She had dismantled them using terrain, patience, psychology, and silence. One of the younger analysts turned to the general. "Sir, this changes our metrics. Her score isn't even measurable under the standard criteria." "She doesn't need a score," Aderos murmured. "She needs a unit." From the shadowed corner of the room, another voice, female, cold, refined, broke in. "She doesn't need a unit either." The others turned. Director Silma, head of Greywake Division, stepped into the light. Her hair was pinned with surgical precision, her slate gray suit marked by no insignia, only the obsidian pin of her agency. She didn't blink as Kalani's camouflaged figure filled the screen again. "She's not a soldier," Silma said. She's a system disruptor. General Aderos raised an eyebrow. She's a girl with trauma and instincts, not a doctrine. Quote, "That's exactly what we need," Silma replied. "Not doctrine, not obedience, adaptation. Kailani is not conditioned like the others. She's reaction incarnate. She doesn't follow threat assessment. She is the threat." The room fell into heavy silence. On the screen, Kailani was crouched beside a collapsed Myra, binding her wounds. Not as an enemy, as a medic. She wasn't cruel, just precise. She didn't need to destroy her opponents, only stop them. "She still shows mercy," one instructor muttered. "No," Silma corrected. "She shows strategy. Injuring is better than killing. Fear lasts longer than death." Aderos frowned. "You want to recruit her into Greywake?" "I want to rewrite Greywake around her," Silma said. "She's not an operative. She's a prototype." Kailani's actions had already caused tremors within their tightly controlled ecosystem. Recruitment offers were being drafted from Blackridge Academy, from the Foreign PsyOps Initiative, from sectors that previously saw her as expendable, but none of them understood her like Silma did. Kailani didn't act out of vengeance or pride. She acted from code, one they hadn't written. Silma turned away from the screen. "Activate Phase 7. A junior operative choked. "Phase 7? But she's not even been debriefed yet." "She doesn't need debriefing," Silma said. "She already passed the final test before we ever gave her the first one." In the jungle, Kailani stood alone now. The final flare had gone off. The trial was over. She didn't wait for extraction. She turned her back on the sky and walked deeper into the trees, knowing they would follow her footsteps all the way to their future. And in the control room, the old rules died quietly. They expected her to wait for extraction like every other candidate. Kailani did not. She walked away from the flare zone, not in defiance but in declaration. The jungle was no longer their proving ground. It had become hers. And when the chopper blades echoed over the treetops 30 minutes later, they found no trace of her. Not even a footprint. Back in the control room, Silma watched with a small, knowing smile. This was exactly what she had predicted. Kailani didn't crave validation. She didn't need applause. She needed purpose. And that, Silma thought, was something only she could offer her. 3 days passed with no word. Then, at exactly 3:03 a.m. on the fourth night, a silent alarm triggered in the heart of Greywake HQ. A breach, one that had bypassed biometric locks, thermal scanners, and multi-factor encryption. Cameras inside the archive room blinked to static for 8 seconds. When they returned, nothing had been stolen. Except time. It was a message. On a whiteboard left in the sub-basement, written in mud from the jungle and traced with vines, were 5 words. The jungle was the weapon. Silma arrived within minutes, her staff scrambling around her. "No prints, no fibers," the tech lead stammered. "No audio signature." She didn't trip a single system. "Because she didn't enter as a threat," Silma muttered. "She entered as environment." Kailani had done the impossible. She had turned their surveillance fortress into just another forest. And in doing so, she had made her intentions clear. She was not their prey, and she would never be their puppet. She was done being tested. Now, she was choosing the battlefield. Silma's orders came swiftly. Wipe the footage. Archive the incident as a failed drone calibration. Then open Project Echo. One of the advisors hesitated. But Project Echo is theoretical. Not anymore. Across the ocean, in the heavily fortified diplomatic zone of Calros Prime, whispers of Kailani's name had already begun spreading. Not in military briefings or press statements, but in private conversations among mercenaries, data brokers, and high-ranking defectors. They spoke of the girl who had killed no one and still won. The girl who bent vines, shadows, terrain, and panic into weapons. The girl who disappeared into the jungle and reappeared inside a vault with no doors. One warlord called her the Whisperblade. Another called her Earthblood. But the one name that stuck was born from fear. The weaponless Widowmaker. Kailani had become something new, something none of them had a countermeasure for. And she had done it without ever drawing a blade. Back in the jungle, Kailani perched atop a rocky rise watching storm clouds brew on the horizon. She wasn't hiding. She was learning. The terrain had more secrets to offer, more angles, more pressure points. She had never needed a gun. She had the wind. She had sound. She had time. Most importantly, she had learned that weapons can be disarmed, but the world cannot. Behind her, a rustle in the trees. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. Instead, she spoke. "You followed me here." From the thicket, a figure emerged. Silma. Unarmed. Unaccompanied. Unsmiling. "I didn't come to bring you back," she said. "I came to ask if you'll teach us what you know." Kailani glanced sideways. "You already failed my first lesson." Silma raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Kailani stepped forward. The wind stirred the leaves behind her like ghosts bowing in recognition. "If you want to survive without weapons," she said, "stop treating the world like an obstacle and start treating it like an accomplice." Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked. And between them, a silent understanding was forged. She would not be recruited. She would be studied. But not from behind glass. From within the wild. Because Kailani was no longer their candidate. She was now the condition by which all future missions would be measured. The myths came first, hushed rumors that spread like smoke through shadow networks. She could walk through sensor nets undetected. She could listen to coded radio frequencies without equipment. She could dismantle a man's psyche without uttering a word. But Kailani didn't care about myths. She was far too busy testing reality. After her disappearance and reappearance, Greywake expected her to go rogue. But instead, she did something they hadn't anticipated. She showed up at a Greywake black site in the Arctic. Alone. Unarmed. Coated in frost and silence. The guards were prepared to kill her on sight. Then she handed them a microchip embedded in a chunk of frozen meat, retrieved from a downed drone 2 years prior, thought lost in a war zone hundreds of miles away. She had found it during her wandering, because she had gone back. Back into the chaos Greywake had long abandoned. She wasn't collecting data. She was collecting truth. And now, she was ready to deliver it. Inside the base, she requested no food, no heat, no briefing. Just one thing. Put me through the Phantom Protocol. A collective silence fell across the room. No one had invoked the Phantom Protocol in over a decade. It wasn't training. It was obliteration. A simulated death. A reawakening through nothing but instinct, pattern recognition, and psychological endurance. Candidates had broken in hours. Some never came back. And those who did, they weren't the same. But Kailani wasn't asking for permission. She was daring them. And Silma, after reviewing the Arctic footage in her underground office, issued one order. Let her in. The chamber was built 90 meters below sea level. No clocks. No light. No directional sound. She was injected with a paralytic, then subjected to the illusion of capture, torture, and betrayal. She saw visions of her childhood spliced with distorted memories of her teammates. Falsehoods designed to fracture her sense of identity. But Kailani did not resist. She observed. She mapped. She memorized the patterns within the madness. And on the 6th night, something unexpected happened. The system, designed to test her perception, began to glitch. The hallucinations destabilized. The algorithm fell into recursion. Because Kailani wasn't responding with fear or violence. She was communicating with the simulation. Her breathing synced with the pulse of the chamber. Her silence confused the sensors. Her stillness fooled the biometric threat assessments. The AI behind Phantom Protocol logged a warning. Subject has reached undefined state. Compliance, OR, complete ascendance, unknown. On the 7th day, the chamber lights flickered. For the first time in history, Phantom Protocol shut itself down. Doors opened. No alarms. No staff. Just silence. And Kailani walked out, barefoot, unshaken, and untouched. Silma met her at the threshold. "Do you even know what you've done?" she asked. Kailani stared through her. "Your machine tried to break me," she replied. But it forgot one thing. Selma's voice was a whisper. "What?" Kailani looked toward the stars rising beyond the snow. "I already died a long time ago. All you did was invite me back." That night, Greywake's highest-ranking officers met in an unlisted outpost in the Shetland Sea. Their conclusion was unanimous. Kailani wasn't just trained anymore. She was post-training. Beyond doctrine. Beyond drills. Beyond prediction. And worse, for them, she had no allegiance. No flag. No weakness. Not because she lacked emotion, but because she had mastered the full weight of it. Pain, loyalty, betrayal, fear, all filed neatly in her mind, not to be avoided, but to be weaponized. The next phase wouldn't involve teaching her anything. It would involve learning from her. And Kailani? She wasn't done evolving. She was just getting started. The first mistake they made was assuming war always comes with gunfire. That it arrives in tanks, in drones, in the echo of explosions. But Kailani knew better. She had walked into cities where war had already happened, but no one heard it. Where peace was a polished lie, and the silence screamed in frequencies only the broken could hear. Greywake sent her to one of those places next. A diplomatic mission, officially. An urban security consultation, unofficially. But in truth, it was a test. They called it Grid City 7, a private, corporatized, smart city somewhere on the Pacific Rim. Hyper-efficient, hyper-surveilled. No crime on record in 6 years. But something was deeply wrong. The air smelled of lithium and paranoia. Citizens smiled too often and blinked too little. Children played in silence, synchronized like choreography. No laughter, no mistakes, no accidents. Just perfection. Too much of it. Kailani didn't walk in with a briefcase or clearance code. She walked in with a child's toy, the same toy the children played with. She mimicked their mannerisms, their blank stares, their strange cadence, and within 3 hours, she triggered the city's first anomaly alert in over half a decade. That was her goal. Because Greywake had warned her, if something reacts to your presence, that's where you begin. Security personnel approached her. Their uniforms looked normal, but their eyes were dilated. One tried to escort her out. She placed a hand on his wrist and whispered, "Are you awake?" He flinched, a microspasm of recognition, and was pulled away by 2 others almost instantly. Kailani knew what that meant. He wasn't just an operative. He was a prisoner. And she had just awakened something. She let herself be detained. Let them scan her, probe her, monitor her vitals. They injected her with a cognitive rebalancer. But it had no effect. Because Kailani's mind didn't operate on conventional biofeedback anymore, her brainwaves scrambled their analytics. She could appear asleep while fully alert. She could suppress her fight-or-flight responses so thoroughly, even death itself had trouble recognizing her. In the sterile detainment pod, she waited and watched. There were no guards, only synthetic voices. Questions posed in neutral tones. Images flashed across the walls, family scenes, flags, animals. Each one laced with subliminal messaging, emotional triggers, code words. But Kailani didn't answer. She blinked, exactly once every 4.7 seconds. It threw off the algorithm's predictive modeling. It caused the entire system to recalibrate. Until, finally, someone came. Not synthetic. Not robotic. A woman in her 50s. Human. Almost. She called herself the moderator. And her first words were chilling. "You don't belong here." "But neither do I." Kailani replied softly, "Then why haven't you left?" The moderator smiled sadly. "Because I helped build it." What followed wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation. And through it, Kailani learned the truth. Grid City 7 wasn't just a smart city. It was a cognitive control field. a prototype in a series of experimental environments designed to rewire emotional response at scale. Joy was regulated. Anger was dissolved. Fear was rerouted. No one resisted, not because they agreed, but because they'd forgotten how. And the moderator? She was the last mind not fully absorbed. I tried to fix it from the inside, she said, but they've evolved. Kailani stood slowly. You don't fix systems like this, you short-circuit them. But how? Kailani smiled. I carry noise. In the heart of silence, Kailani unleashed chaos, not with bombs, not with weapons, but with memory. A frequency embedded in her voice, linked to the sound of a mother screaming, a child laughing, a protest rising. A frequency the system couldn't filter because it came from real human pain. The system glitched. The smiles cracked. Children stopped moving in sync. For the first time in years, someone screamed. It wasn't fear. It was awakening. Within hours, Grid City 7 went dark. Kailani walked out alone, through clouds of static and blinking lights. Greywake agents tried to reach her, but she was already gone. Not in defiance, but in design. Because this wasn't about orders anymore. It was about reclaiming silence from the machines that stole it. And in that silence, Kailani was learning to speak again. With purpose. With fire. With war in every syllable. But this war would leave no trace. Only survivors who finally remembered how to feel. Greywake had lost her signal for 47 hours. Not because Kailani was captured. Not because she had failed. But because she'd done something the agency hadn't accounted for. She had disappeared from space. Literally. The satellite grid that tracked neural emissions, Project Odyssey, blinked offline the moment Kailani stepped into the mountains of Svalbard. No war zone. No targets. Just wind, ice, and a sky thick with coded storms. Why was she there? Because war doesn't only happen in cities. Sometimes the battlefield is in the clouds. Greywake called it the Sky Choir. A classified project buried beneath kilometers of rock, cloaked from heat mapping and pulse radar. And Kailani? She had traced its origin through an encrypted whisper sent from Grid City 7. 3 words. Look up. Listen. Listen. Inside the Arctic silence, she moved like an apparition. Layers of thermoptic shielding wrapped around her. Heart rate down to 39 beats per minute. Breath synchronized to falling snow. She wasn't just hiding. She was becoming invisible to machines. Because the choir didn't use sound. It used resonance. A frequency too high to hear, but strong enough to fracture thought patterns from above. What started as a satellite communications project had evolved into cognitive modulation from orbit. And the signals? They were embedded in music, streaming apps, podcasts, even ambient white noise. Each one calibrated to influence sleep, decision-making, impulse. The effect wasn't immediate, but prolonged exposure created compliance patterns. Softer rebellions, duller outrage, weaker wills. Kailani knew this wasn't new. But this was perfected. At the edge of the glacial cliff, she found the relay. A metallic bloom of antennas disguised as part of the landscape. Silent, beautiful, deadly. She watched it for 17 minutes. Just long enough to recognize the pulse pattern, 7273. It matched one thing, Project Requiem. The only file Greywake had ever buried beneath 8 firewalls. Kailani had read it once, at age 17. Before she was recruited. Before she was broken down and rebuilt as an interrogation phantom. And what she remembered terrified her. Requiem wasn't a weapon. It was a lullaby for nations. An algorithm designed not to destroy, but to delay collapse. By muting dissent. By pacifying suffering. By making people forget the taste of freedom until obedience felt like comfort. And the Sky Choir? It was singing humanity to sleep. Kailani could not allow that. She climbed. across ridges that shattered drones, through ice storms that chewed through aircraft. Every step a test of her lungs, her past injuries, her human limits. Until she reached the control chamber. Inside was a man. Old, quiet, alone. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at her and said, "I thought it would be you." Kehlani paused. "You knew me?" He nodded. "I was at the beginning. I helped select you for Greywake, back when you were still a girl who couldn't cry." She stared at him, not with anger, but with something colder. "I remember your voice. You told me pain could be a compass. And you proved me right," he whispered. "I came here to silence the choir," Kehlani said. "I know," he replied, "and I'll help you." "Why?" "Because you're the only one who still knows the difference between silence and peace." He handed her a device. A bone-white key shaped like a tuning fork. It hummed in her hand, resonating with her own scars. "The choir listens to emotion more than code," he explained. "You must feed it something it cannot absorb." Kehlani nodded. She stepped to the console, removed her gloves, and pressed both palms to the neural interface. Then she did the one thing Greywake never trained her for. She cried. Not as a soldier, not as a weapon, but as the child she used to be, lost in a ruined village, trying to sing above the screams. The system trembled. The choir stuttered. The sky went quiet, and satellites blinked, not in failure, but in surrender. Across the globe, people paused mid-scroll. They didn't know why, but for the first time in years, their minds felt clear. Not manipulated, not lulled, just free. Kehlani collapsed, breathless, as snow fell around her. The man caught her before she hit the ground. "You've rewritten the song," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because the silence that followed wasn't dead anymore. It was alive. And above them, for the first time in a decade, the stars returned, no longer filtered through signal noise. Kehlani had made the satellites blink. And with that blink, the world began to wake. They returned to the crater where Talon Reach once stood. Journalists, investigators, even former generals came to examine the ruins, still warm from the fires that had licked through steel, concrete, and command. But none of them found Kehlani Reese. Not even her body. What they found instead were charred emblems, twisted insignias, and a message carved with what appeared to be a sharpened stone into the exposed belly of the last standing bunker. "I used what you left behind." The tribunal held in the capital months later declared the entire operation unlawful. Survivors from the upper tiers of the academy refused to speak publicly, but some of their families whispered that it wasn't the jungle that had killed their sons and daughters. It was her, the ghost in the vines, the trap setter, the storm they had invited. Colonel Dagan was never seen again. His last recorded words, "Let her burn," were leaked, alongside the footage from the command tower showing the moment Kehlani disabled the station's power supply using only storm runoff and salvaged wiring. For some, she became a cautionary tale. For others, a legend. But for those who truly knew what happened at Talon Reach, she was a reckoning long overdue. The jungle eventually reclaimed the ruins. Roots cracked through metal, vines choked the towers. And in the center of the overgrowth, at the place where Kehlani had first been pushed into the gauntlet, there now stood a single tree, twisted, defiant, and thriving among the ash. Some say she planted it herself. Others believe she became it. And in hushed tones, cadets of new generations tell each other of a woman who once walked into a death zone with no weapon and turned the earth into a graveyard for giants. Because what she carried wasn't steel. It was vengeance, survival, and the patience of stone. She didn't just survive the gauntlet. She rewrote its laws. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.